The afternoon sun was starting to fade as 17-year-old Damon walked down Maple Street, his blue work shirt still damp with sweat from his shift at Patterson's bookstore. His backpack hung heavy on his shoulders, filled with textbooks he planned to study later that evening. The neighborhood around him was quiet, the kind of place where people kept their lawns perfectly trimmed and their cars washed every weekend. Damon had been working at the bookstore for 8 months now, saving every penny for college. His boss, Mr. Patterson, always praised his work ethic and reliability. Today had been especially busy with back-to-school shoppers, but Damon didn't mind. Each dollar he earned brought him closer to his dream of studying engineering. As he walked, Damon noticed a police car slowly cruising behind him. He didn't think much of it at first. Police cars were common in this area, and he had done nothing wrong. He kept walking, humming quietly to himself as he thought about the calculus homework waiting for him at home. Officer Rick Matthews had been patrolling Riverside Heights for over 15 years. He knew every street, every corner, and most importantly, he knew who belonged and who didn't. When he spotted the young black teenager walking through one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city, something didn't sit right with him. Matthews slowed his patrol car, studying the kid more closely. The teenager was well-dressed, clean, and walking calmly, but Matthews had learned to trust his instincts. In his experience, young men like this one didn't usually have legitimate business in neighborhoods like Riverside Heights. He pulled over and stepped out of his car, his hand automatically resting on his belt near his radio. The afternoon was warm, but Matthews felt the familiar rush he always got when making a stop. This was what real police work looked like. "Hey, hold up there," Matthews called out, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he had perfected over the years. Damon stopped walking and turned around, confused, but not alarmed. He had been taught by his parents to always be respectful when dealing with police officers. "Yes, officer?" Matthews approached slowly, his eyes scanning Damon from head to toe. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "I'm walking home from work, sir," Damon replied politely, shifting his backpack to show the bookstore logo on his shirt. "I work at Patterson's bookstore downtown." Matthews noticed the shirt but wasn't convinced. Anyone could put on a uniform. "You live around here?" "No, sir. I live about 6 blocks that way." Damon pointed east toward his family's modest neighborhood. "I always walk through here because it's the shortest route from the bus stop." The officer's expression hardened. "Let me see some identification." Damon reached slowly into his back pocket, careful to move deliberately so there would be no misunderstanding. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his student ID and work badge. His hands were steady, but his heart had started beating faster. Matthews examined the cards with exaggerated care, taking much longer than necessary. "These could be fake," he muttered, loud enough for Damon to hear. "Officer, I can call my boss if you need verification," Damon offered. "Mr. Patterson knows me well. I've been working there since last January." "I didn't ask you to call anyone," Matthews snapped. "I'm conducting an investigation here." Damon felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm weather. He had never been in trouble before, never even gotten a detention at school. His parents had raised him to work hard, be respectful, and stay out of trouble. "What kind of investigation, sir?" Matthews stepped closer, invading Damon's personal space. "We've had reports of break-ins in this area. Young men fitting your description have been seen casing houses. I've never broken into anything, officer. I'm just trying to get home to do my homework." "Sure you are," Matthews said with a smirk. "Empty your pockets. All of them." Damon's stomach dropped, but he complied. He pulled out his phone, his bus pass, a few crumpled dollar bills, and his house keys. Matthews examined each item as if they might reveal some hidden crime. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," Matthews ordered. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong." "Am I under arrest?" "Don't get smart with me, kid. Just do what I tell you." Damon placed his hands on the warm metal of the police car, feeling humiliated as a few neighbors started to peer out from their windows. Matthews began patting him down roughly, checking every pocket twice. "I don't smell any substances on you, but that doesn't mean anything," Matthews said. "Dealers are getting smarter these days." "I don't do drugs, officer. I'm on the honor roll at Lincoln High School." Matthews chuckled coldly. "Honor roll?" "Right. That's what they all say." What Damon didn't know was that Mrs. Chen, who lived in the house across the street, had been watching the entire encounter from her living room window. Something about the situation bothered her enough that she started recording with her phone. Her doorbell camera had also been activated by the movement in the street. 3 houses down, the Martinez family's security system had automatically started recording when it detected the police car stopping. The cameras captured everything from multiple angles, recording not just the visual interaction but also the audio of the conversation. Matthews finished his search and stepped back, clearly frustrated that he had found nothing incriminating. "So where exactly do you claim to live?" Damon gave his address, which Matthews wrote down in his notepad with deliberate slowness. "And you're telling me you walk through here every day?" "Yes, sir. Monday through Friday after work, and sometimes on weekends when I pick up extra shifts." The officer looked around the neighborhood, noting the expensive houses and manicured lawns. In his mind, this kid had no business being here. "Well, I'm going to need to verify your story. You're going to come with me to the station while we sort this out." Damon's heart raced. "Officer, I really haven't done anything wrong. Can't you just call the bookstore? Mr. Patterson will vouch for me." "I've heard enough from you," Matthews said, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for loitering and suspicious activity." "But I was just walking home. And resisting arrest," Matthews added with a satisfied grin as he clicked the handcuffs around Damon's wrists. "Maybe next time you'll think twice about where you decide to take your little walks." As Matthews pushed Damon toward the patrol car, the teenager caught sight of Mrs. Chen watching from her window. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he saw something in her expression that gave him a tiny spark of hope. She looked upset, angry even, and she was still holding her phone. Matthews opened the back door of the patrol car and pushed Damon inside. "Comfortable?" he asked with mock concern before slamming the door shut. As they drove toward the police station, Matthews felt satisfied with his work. Another potential troublemaker was off the streets. He had no doubt that his report would be accepted without question, just as it always was. After all, who was going to believe a kid like this over a veteran police officer with 15 years of experience? But as the patrol car disappeared around the corner, Mrs. Chen was already downloading the video from her phone, and the security cameras throughout the neighborhood had captured every moment of what had just happened. The truth had been recorded, waiting patiently to be discovered. Dr. Lisa Thompson was in the middle of examining a young patient when her phone buzzed with a call from the police station. At first, she almost ignored it, thinking it might be a wrong number, but something made her excuse herself and step into the hallway to answer. "Is this the mother of Damon Thompson?" the voice on the other end asked in a flat, bureaucratic tone. Her world stopped. "Yes, that's my son." "Is he hurt? What happened?" "Ma'am, your son has been arrested. You can pick him up at the downtown station after processing is complete." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Arrested for what?" "There has to be some mistake." "Ma'am, I don't have those details. You'll need to speak with the arresting officer when you come in." Dr. Thompson's hands shook as she ended the call. Damon had never been in any kind of trouble. He was a straight-A student, worked part-time, and spent his free time either studying or volunteering at the community center. This made no sense. She immediately called her husband, Robert, who was in the middle of teaching his afternoon history class at Roosevelt High School. When he heard the news, he felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. "I'm leaving school right now," he told his wife. "Meet me at the station." Robert had been teaching for 22 years and had seen too many bright young men like his son get caught up in the system. He knew that sometimes being young and black was enough to make someone suspicious in the wrong person's eyes. But he had always hoped his son would be different, that his good grades and clean record would protect him. At the police station, the couple waited for 3 hours before they were allowed to see their son. When Damon finally appeared, his parents barely recognized him. His confident posture was gone, replaced by hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. His wrists showed red marks from the handcuffs, and his work shirt was wrinkled and stained. "Dad, Mom, I didn't do anything wrong," were the first words out of his mouth, his voice cracking with emotion. Officer Matthews appeared behind Damon, still wearing that same satisfied expression he had maintained throughout the arrest. "Your son was caught loitering in the Riverside Heights area. When I approached him for questioning, he became belligerent and resisted arrest." Dr. Thompson looked at her son, then back at the officer. "That doesn't sound like Damon at all. He's never been in any kind of trouble." "Well, there's a first time for everything," Matthews replied with a shrug. "Kids can fool their parents pretty easily." Robert felt his anger rising but forced himself to stay calm. What exactly are the charges? Loitering, resisting arrest, and we're still investigating possible drug-related activities. Drugs? Dr. Thompson's voice rose in disbelief. Officer, my son has never touched drugs in his life. He's been tested for his job and for athletics. Matthews crossed his arms. Like I said, kids can be very good at hiding things from their parents. The family was told that Damon would be released on his own recognizance, but would have to appear in court the following month. As they walked to their car, Damon finally broke down. I was just walking home from work, he sobbed. I showed him my ID, my work badge, everything. But he kept saying I didn't belong in that neighborhood. That night, the Thompson family sat around their kitchen table, trying to make sense of what had happened. Dr. Thompson had called her brother, who recommended a civil rights attorney named Catherine Williams. We need to fight this, she told her husband. This is exactly the kind of thing we've seen happen to other families. I won't let them destroy our son's future over lies. Robert nodded, but inside he felt helpless. He had spent years teaching his students about civil rights and justice, but now that his own family was facing this situation, the system felt overwhelming. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Matthews was finishing up his report. He wrote that Damon had been acting suspiciously in an area known for recent break-ins. He described the teenager as uncooperative and hostile, and noted that he had reasonable suspicion of drug activity. Even though no drugs had been found, as he typed, Matthews felt confident in his version of events. He had handled situations like this dozens of times over his career, and his word had never been seriously questioned. Police officers were trusted members of the community, and judges knew they could rely on their testimony. What Matthews didn't know was that his encounter with Damon had been recorded by multiple cameras throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen had already saved the video from her phone and was debating whether she should get involved. She had immigrated to the United States 30 years ago and had always been grateful for the opportunities this country had given her family. But what she had witnessed troubled her deeply. The next morning, Catherine Williams met with the Thompson family at her law office. She was a woman in her 40s who had built her reputation defending people whose civil rights had been violated. She listened carefully as Damon recounted his story, taking detailed notes. This officer has a pattern, she told them after hearing the details. I've seen his name come up in several cases over the years, but nothing that ever went to trial. What does that mean? Robert asked. It means the department usually settles these cases quietly and officers like Matthews continue working without facing real consequences. Dr. Thompson felt sick to her stomach. So this has happened before? I'm afraid so. But every case is different, and we need to build the strongest possible defense for Damon. Catherine explained that they would need to investigate Matthews' history, look for witnesses, and gather any evidence that contradicted his report. The good news is that your son has an excellent reputation. His school records, work performance, and lack of any criminal history will work in his favor. Over the following days, word of Damon's arrest spread through their community. His classmates at Lincoln High School couldn't believe that their honor roll student had been arrested. His co-workers at the bookstore were equally shocked. Mr. Patterson, his boss, immediately offered to testify on Damon's behalf. That boy is one of the most honest, hard-working young men I've ever employed, he told Catherine Williams. If Officer Matthews had bothered to call me, I would have vouched for him immediately. But the damage was already being done. Damon found it hard to concentrate in school, jumping every time he heard a siren. He had nightmares about being handcuffed and couldn't bring himself to walk through Riverside Heights anymore, even though it added 20 minutes to his commute from work. His parents watched their confident, ambitious son become withdrawn and anxious. Dr. Thompson had to take time off work to attend meetings with lawyers and school counselors. Robert found himself losing his temper with students who reminded him of Officer Matthews. We can't let this break our family apart, Dr. Thompson told her husband one evening. Damon needs to see us fighting for him, not falling apart. At the police station, Matthews was enjoying the support of his fellow officers. They had all heard his version of the story and agreed that he had handled the situation appropriately. You can't be too careful these days, Sergeant Davis told him. Better safe than sorry. Matthews felt vindicated by this support. In his mind, he was a hero who had prevented a potential crime. The fact that no evidence of wrongdoing had been found only proved how clever these young criminals had become. but 3 blocks away from the police station. Mrs. Chen was sitting in her living room staring at the video on her phone. She had watched it dozens of times, and each viewing made her more certain that she had witnessed an injustice. Her husband had warned her not to get involved. "We have our own family to think about," he had said, but Mrs. Chen couldn't stop thinking about the look in that young man's eyes as he was handcuffed and pushed into the police car. Finally, she made her decision. She picked up her phone and called the number on Catherine Williams's website. "I think I have something you need to see," she said quietly into the phone. Catherine Williams had handled dozens of civil rights cases over her 15-year career. But she still felt a surge of excitement when Mrs. Chen walked into her office, carrying a tablet with the video footage. The recording was clearer than anything she had seen in years. "I couldn't sleep after what I witnessed," Mrs. Chen explained, her voice soft but determined. "That officer was wrong from the very beginning." As Catherine watched the footage, she could hardly believe what she was seeing. The video clearly showed Damon being polite and cooperative throughout the entire encounter. Officer Matthews's aggressive behavior was captured in perfect detail, along with his dismissive comments and obvious bias. "Mrs. Chen, this changes everything," Catherine said. "Would you be willing to testify about what you saw?" The older woman nodded firmly. "I came to this country believing in justice. If I stay silent now, what does that say about who I am?" With this crucial evidence in hand, Catherine began a deeper investigation into Officer Matthews' background. What she discovered was deeply troubling. Over his 15-year career, Matthews had arrested 247 people. Of those arrests, 192 involved people of color, despite working in a district that was only 23% minority. She found complaint after complaint that had been filed against Matthews over the years. Citizens had accused him of harassment, excessive force, and racial profiling. But somehow none of these complaints had resulted in serious discipline. The system protected him, Catherine explained to Dr. and Robert Thompson during one of their meetings. Each complaint was investigated internally, and each time, Matthews was cleared or given minimal punishment. Robert shook his head in disgust. "So families just gave up?" "Many did. Fighting the police department is expensive and emotionally draining. Some families accepted small settlements to avoid going to court." Catherine's investigation also revealed that Matthews had received several commendations from his superiors over the years. He was praised for his proactive policing and his ability to keep crime rates low in his assigned area. What they called proactive policing, I call harassment, Catherine told her assistant as they reviewed the files. Meanwhile, Damon was struggling with the psychological impact of his arrest. His grades had started to slip for the first time in his academic career. He had trouble sleeping and found himself constantly looking over his shoulder when walking down the street. His parents enrolled him in counseling sessions with Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. During their sessions, Damon talked about feeling like his future had been stolen from him. "I used to believe that if you worked hard and followed the rules, you'd be okay," he told Dr. Rodriguez. "Now I feel like none of that matters." The counselor helped Damon understand that his feelings were normal responses to an abnormal situation. "What happened to you was wrong," she assured him. "Your anger and fear are completely justified." But the case was taking a toll on the entire family. Dr. Thompson found herself distracted at work, making minor mistakes that she had never made before. Robert had to take a leave of absence from teaching because he couldn't concentrate on his lessons. "Sometimes I wonder if we should just accept a plea deal and move on," Robert admitted to his wife one evening. "No," Dr. Thompson replied firmly. "If we don't fight this, Matthews will do it again to someone else's child." Catherine's investigation had expanded beyond Matthews himself to look at the entire police department's culture. She discovered that the department had paid out over $2 million in settlements related to officer misconduct over the past 5 years. But none of those settlements required admissions of wrongdoing. She also found that the department's training on racial bias was minimal and outdated. Officers attended a half-day workshop every 3 years, and there was no ongoing education about community relations or de-escalation techniques. "It's a system that breeds this kind of behavior," Catherine explained to a local reporter who had started following the case. "When officers face no real consequences for their actions, some of them start to believe they're above the law." The story began getting media attention, which made Matthews uncomfortable for the first time. He was used to operating in the shadows, where his word was rarely questioned. Now reporters were asking questions about his arrest record and his history of complaints. Matthews tried to stay confident, but privately, he was worried. He met with his union representative, a gruff man named Tony Breslin, who had been defending officers for over 20 years. "Don't sweat it," Breslin told him. "We've handled worse cases than this. It's your word against some kids, and juries trust cops." But Breslin hadn't seen the video footage yet. Catherine was keeping that evidence carefully protected, planning to reveal it at the most strategic moment. As the case moved toward trial, Catherine discovered more witnesses. A postal worker named Jerome Washington came forward to say he had seen Matthews harassing other young people in the neighborhood. A store clerk named Patricia Gomez said Matthews had made inappropriate comments about customers based on their race. "He always acted like he owned that neighborhood," Washington told Catherine. "Like anyone who didn't look like him didn't belong there." Catherine also brought in expert witnesses to testify about racial profiling and police misconduct. Dr. Michael Foster, a criminologist from the State University, analyzed Matthews' arrest patterns and found clear evidence of discriminatory enforcement. "The statistical evidence is overwhelming," Dr. Foster explained. "This pattern of arrests cannot be explained by random chance or legitimate law enforcement activity." Meanwhile, Officer Matthews was getting advice from multiple sources. Some of his colleagues told him to stick to his story no matter what. Others suggested he might want to consider early retirement to avoid the stress of a trial. But Matthews was stubborn. He had built his identity around being a tough cop who didn't back down from anyone. The idea of admitting he was wrong went against everything he believed about himself. "I did nothing wrong," he told his wife over dinner one evening. "That kid was up to something, and I could tell." His wife, Patricia, had grown tired of hearing about the case. She had seen her husband's behavior toward people of different backgrounds over the years, but she had always chosen to ignore it. Now it was becoming impossible to pretend she didn't notice. "Rick, maybe you should just apologize and move on," she suggested gently. Matthews slammed his fork down on the table. "Apologize? For doing my job? I don't think so." As the trial date approached, Catherine felt confident in her case but knew that nothing was guaranteed. Police officers were rarely convicted of misconduct, even when the evidence seemed clear. She spent long hours preparing Damon for his testimony, helping him understand that the defense would try to make him look bad. "They're going to ask you about every mistake you've ever made," she warned him. "They might bring up times you got in trouble at school or ask about your friends or try to suggest you were lying about something." Damon nodded seriously. "I understand, but I'm going to tell the truth just like I did that day." The night before the trial began, Mrs. Chen called Catherine to make sure she was still willing to testify. "Are you having second thoughts?" Catherine asked. "No," Mrs. Chen replied. "I'm nervous, but I know this is the right thing to do. That young man deserves justice." At the police station, Matthews was getting ready for what he expected to be a routine court appearance. He had testified hundreds of times over his career, and judges and juries almost always believed his version of events. He put on his best uniform and practiced his testimony one more time in the mirror. He was confident, prepared, and certain that his reputation and experience would carry the day. What he didn't know was that Catherine Williams had spent months building an airtight case that would expose not just his actions on that one afternoon, but a career-long pattern of discrimination and abuse of power. The truth was about to come to light, and no amount of confidence or preparation could change what the cameras had recorded on that warm afternoon in Riverside Heights. The courthouse was packed on the first day of trial. Local media had picked up the story, and community activists had organized supporters to fill the gallery. Damon sat between his parents in the front row, wearing his best suit and trying to look confident despite the butterflies in his stomach. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order and looked out over the crowded courtroom. She was a veteran judge who had seen plenty of these cases over her 20-year career. She knew that police misconduct trials were always complicated, with emotions running high on both sides. The prosecutor, District Attorney James Chen, stood to give his opening statement. He was a serious man in his 50s who had built his reputation on taking on difficult cases that other prosecutors avoided. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, This case is about abuse of power. It's about what happens when someone sworn to protect and serve instead chooses to intimidate and harm. The evidence will show that Officer Matthews violated Damon Thompson's civil rights based on nothing more than the color of his skin. Matthews sat at the defense table next to his lawyer, Frank Morrison, an expensive attorney hired by the police union. Morrison was known for getting officers acquitted even in difficult cases, and he exuded confidence as he prepared for his opening statement. My client is a decorated police officer with 15 years of exemplary service, Morrison told the jury. Officer Matthews was doing his job, investigating suspicious activity in a neighborhood that had experienced recent break-ins. What happened that day was good police work, not discrimination. The prosecution's first witness was Damon himself. Catherine Williams had prepared him extensively for this moment, but nothing could completely eliminate the nervousness he felt walking to the witness stand. Tell the jury what you were doing on the afternoon of your arrest, D.A. Chen prompted. Damon spoke clearly, describing his normal routine of walking home from work through Riverside Heights. He explained about his job at the bookstore, his good grades, and his college plans. When Officer Matthews first approached you, what did you think? I was confused, Damon replied honestly. I thought maybe there had been an accident or something, and he needed to ask if I had seen anything. Under direct examination, Damon came across as sincere and credible. He answered questions about his background, his family, and his version of events during the arrest. Then came the cross-examination, and defense attorney Morrison went on the attack. Mr. Thompson, isn't it true that you had been in that neighborhood before looking at expensive houses and cars? I walk through there every day going to and from work, but you've stopped to look at houses, haven't you? Houses you could never afford on your bookstore salary? Catherine objected to the question's relevance, but Morrison was trying to plant seeds of doubt about Damon's motives for being in the area. You were angry when Officer Matthews stopped you, weren't you? Morrison continued. I was confused and then scared, but I wasn't angry until he started treating me like a criminal for no reason. So you admit you were angry, and when you're angry, you don't always make the best decisions, do you? Catherine objected again, but Morrison had accomplished his goal of making Damon seem less sympathetic to the jury. The next day, Officer Matthews took the stand in his own defense. He walked to the witness stand in full uniform, his posture straight and his expression serious. He had testified hundreds of times before and knew how to present himself as a credible professional. Morrison led him through his background and experience, emphasizing his years of service and his commendations from supervisors. Tell the jury about the afternoon in question, Morrison prompted. Matthews launched into his prepared testimony, describing Damon as suspicious and evasive from the moment he first saw him. The defendant was walking slowly through an area where we had received reports of break-ins, Matthews testified. When I approached him for questioning, he became defensive and uncooperative. Matthews claimed that Damon had refused to provide identification at first, had made furtive movements that suggested he might be concealing something, and had tensed up when asked to submit to a search. I believed there was reasonable suspicion that the defendant might be involved in criminal activity, Matthews concluded. I followed proper procedures throughout the encounter. Under cross-examination, D.A. Chen began to chip away at Matthews's story. Officer Matthews, you testified that Mr. Thompson refused to provide identification, but isn't it true that he immediately handed over his student ID and work badge when you asked? He hesitated first, Matthews replied, sticking to his script. And you said he made furtive movements. Can you describe exactly what those movements were? Matthews struggled to provide specific details, falling back on vague phrases about the defendant, acting nervous and looking around. Chen pressed harder. Officer Matthews, in your 15 years on the force, what percentage of your arrests have involved people of color? Morrison objected, arguing that the question was irrelevant, but Judge Morrison allowed it. Matthews shifted uncomfortably. I don't keep track of statistics like that. I arrest people based on their behavior, not their race. But if the statistics showed a clear pattern of discrimination, that would concern you, wouldn't it? I object to the characterization, Matthews replied defensively. I treat everyone equally. As the cross-examination continued, Matthews began to show his true colors. When Chen asked about previous complaints against him, Matthews became dismissive and arrogant. People file complaints when they get arrested, he said with a shrug. It's a way to try to get out of trouble. Most of those complaints are completely baseless. Most? So some of them were valid. I didn't say that. Matthews backtracked. But the damage was done. Chen also questioned Matthews about his knowledge of the Riverside Heights neighborhood and its demographics. You're familiar with that area, aren't you, Officer Matthews? Of course. I've been patrolling there for years. And would you say it's a predominantly white affluent neighborhood? It's a nice area, yes. So when you see a young black man walking through that neighborhood, that stands out to you? Morrison objected, but Matthews answered anyway. It's not about race. It's about knowing the area and recognizing when something seems out of place. Out of place how? Matthews paused, realizing he was walking into a trap. Just out of the ordinary. The next witness was Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who had recorded the arrest on her phone. She was nervous about testifying, but determined to tell the truth about what she had witnessed. I saw the entire encounter from my living room window, she testified. The young man was walking normally, not doing anything suspicious. The officer seemed aggressive from the very beginning. Under cross-examination, Morrison tried to undermine her credibility by suggesting she had an agenda against police officers. Mrs. Chen, you've been involved in community activism, haven't you? I volunteer at my church and help with neighborhood cleanups. And you have opinions about police officers and how they treat minorities? I believe everyone should be treated fairly, regardless of their background. Morrison couldn't shake her testimony, and her sincerity came through clearly to the jury. The prosecution also called expert witnesses to testify about racial profiling and police procedures. Dr. Michael Foster, the criminologist, presented his statistical analysis of Matthews' arrest patterns. The data shows a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement, Dr. Foster testified. This pattern cannot be explained by legitimate law enforcement factors. Morrison tried to discredit the expert by arguing that statistics could be manipulated, but Dr. Foster's credentials and methodology were solid. As the prosecution wrapped up its case, Catherine Williams felt cautiously optimistic. They had presented strong evidence of discrimination and had shown that Matthews' version of events was inconsistent and self-serving. But she knew that juries were often reluctant to convict police officers, even when the evidence seemed clear. She had saved her most powerful piece of evidence for last, waiting for just the right moment to reveal the video footage that would expose Matthews' lies. Matthews, meanwhile, was starting to feel less confident than he had at the beginning of the trial. The cross-examination had been more aggressive than he had expected, and he could see doubt in some of the jurors' faces. His wife Patricia had attended every day of the trial, and she was beginning to see her husband in a new light. The testimony about his pattern of arrests and the complaints against him painted a picture of someone she wasn't sure she recognized. Maybe we should talk to the prosecutor about a plea agreement, she suggested one evening after court. Absolutely not, Matthews replied angrily. I'm not admitting to something I didn't do. But privately, he was beginning to worry that this case might not go as smoothly as he had hoped. He had always relied on his reputation and the benefit of the doubt that police officers typically received from juries. Now, for the first time in his career, he was facing a prosecutor who wasn't intimidated by his badge and a jury that seemed willing to question his version of events. The stage was set for the final phase of the trial, when the truth would finally be revealed in all its devastating clarity. The courtroom was electric with tension as Catherine Williams stood to address the jury for her closing argument. She had been saving the most crucial piece of evidence for this moment, and she could see the anticipation in the spectators' faces. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, we've heard testimony from both sides. We've heard Officer Matthews claim that he was just doing his job, following proper procedures. We've heard him describe Damon Thompson as suspicious, uncooperative, and potentially dangerous. She paused, walking closer to the jury box. But what if I told you that we don't have to rely on anyone's memory or interpretation of what happened that day? What if you could see for yourselves exactly what occurred? Defense attorney Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Throughout the trial, he had been confident that the case would come down to credibility, and police officers usually won those battles. Your Honor, Catherine continued, I'd like to present evidence that was discovered during our investigation. video footage of the entire encounter between Officer Matthews and Damon Thompson. Judge Morrison allowed the evidence, and the courtroom fell silent as a large screen was wheeled in front of the jury. Catherine had prepared a compilation that showed the arrest from multiple angles, using footage from Mrs. Chen's phone, the Martinez family's security cameras, and 2 other doorbell cameras that had captured different portions of the encounter. This footage is from 4 different sources, Catherine explained. It shows the entire encounter from beginning to end, with clear audio of everything that was said. As the video began to play, Officer Matthews felt his stomach drop. He had no idea that so many cameras had been recording that day, and seeing the encounter from this perspective was devastating to his case. The footage showed Damon walking calmly down the street, clearly wearing his work shirt and carrying his backpack. There was nothing suspicious about his behavior whatsoever. When Matthews approached him, the audio picked up their entire conversation. The jury could hear Damon's polite responses and Matthews' increasingly aggressive tone. They could see that Damon immediately complied when asked for identification, contradicting Matthews' testimony that he had hesitated or been uncooperative. Most damaging of all, the video captured Matthews' attitude throughout the encounter. His body language was aggressive from the start, and his facial expressions showed contempt and satisfaction as he handcuffed the teenager. The audio also picked up comments that Matthews had made under his breath, including a particularly damaging moment when he said, "Maybe this will teach you to stay in your own neighborhood." As the video played, several jurors looked visibly shocked. One woman covered her mouth with her hand while an older man shook his head in disgust. Officer Matthews tried to maintain his composure, but inside he was panicking. The video completely contradicted his testimony, and there was no way to explain away what the jury was seeing and hearing. His attorney frantically scribbled notes, trying to figure out how to respond to this devastating evidence. The video was clear, well-lit, and captured from multiple angles. There was no question about what had really happened that day. When the video ended, the courtroom was dead silent. Catherine Williams let the impact sink in before continuing her closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've now seen the truth. Not Officer Matthews' version of the truth, not anyone's interpretation of events, but the actual truth as recorded by multiple cameras." She pointed toward Matthews, who was staring down at the defense table. "This officer lied under oath. He lied about how Damon behaved, he lied about what he said, and he lied about why he made this arrest." Catherine walked over to where Damon sat with his parents. This young man was guilty of nothing more than walking home from work while black. He was polite, cooperative, and respectful throughout this entire ordeal. And for that, he was handcuffed, arrested, and charged with crimes he did not commit. She returned to face the jury. The video evidence shows clear racial bias. Officer Matthews saw a young black man in a predominantly white neighborhood and decided he didn't belong there. That's not police work, ladies and gentlemen. That's discrimination. Defense attorney Morrison did his best to recover during his closing argument, but the video evidence had destroyed his client's credibility. "The video shows my client was doing his job," he argued weakly. Officer Matthews believed he had reasonable suspicion to investigate suspicious activity in the area, but even Morrison seemed to know his arguments rang hollow after what the jury had just witnessed. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes before returning with their verdict. Judge Morrison called the court to order as the foreman stood to announce their decision. In the matter of the state versus Officer Richard Matthews, on the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers from Damon's supporters. Matthews slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his career and reputation were over. "On the charge of perjury, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty." With each guilty verdict, Matthews seemed to shrink further into himself. The confident, smirking officer who had arrested Damon 6 months earlier was gone, replaced by a broken man facing the consequences of his actions. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month and remanded Matthews to custody pending a pre-sentence investigation. As he was led away in handcuffs, Matthews caught sight of his wife, Patricia, who was crying in the gallery outside the courthouse. Damon spoke to the gathered media with his parents and attorney by his side. "I'm grateful that the jury saw the truth," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "No young person should have to go through what I experienced. I hope this case helps prevent other families from suffering like mine did. Dr. Thompson wiped away tears as she watched her son address the reporters. The confident, articulate young man speaking to the cameras was the same person she had always known. But she could see that the experience had changed him in fundamental ways. "We're proud of how Damon handled this situation," she said. "He never gave up hope that the truth would come out." Catherine Williams also spoke to the media, emphasizing the broader implications of the case. "This verdict sends a message that police officers are not above the law," she said. "When they abuse their power and violate people's civil rights, they will be held accountable." The case had far-reaching consequences beyond Matthews's conviction. The police department came under intense scrutiny, and the mayor announced a comprehensive review of policies and training procedures. Chief of Police Sandra Washington, who had been appointed just 2 years earlier, used the case as an opportunity to implement reforms she had been pushing for since taking the job. "This incident highlights the need for better training, stronger oversight, and increased accountability throughout our department," she announced at a press conference. The department implemented mandatory body cameras for all officers, expanded bias training programs, and created a civilian oversight board to review complaints against police officers. Mrs. Chen, who had played such a crucial role by recording the arrest and coming forward as a witness, was praised for her courage in speaking truth to power. "I did what I hoped someone would do for my own children," she told a local newspaper. "Justice only works when people are willing to stand up for what's right." Officer Matthews was sentenced to 3 years in prison and permanently barred from working in law enforcement. The police union, which had initially supported him, quietly distanced itself from his case after the video evidence emerged. His wife Patricia filed for divorce 6 months after his conviction, saying she could no longer reconcile the man she had married with the person she had seen in that courtroom. For Damon and his family, the victory was bittersweet. While they were grateful for the justice they had received, the experience had taken a significant toll on all of them. Damon continued his counseling sessions with Dr. Rodriguez, working to process the trauma of his arrest and the stress of the trial. He maintained his grades and his job at the bookstore, but his perspective on the world had been forever changed. "I used to think that if you worked hard and followed the rules, you'd be okay," he told his therapist during one session. "Now I understand that sometimes the system fails, and you have to fight for justice." His parents also continued to deal with the aftermath of their son's arrest. Dr. Thompson became involved in community activism, working with other families who had experienced police misconduct. Robert returned to teaching with a renewed passion for educating his students about civil rights and social justice. The video footage from Damon's arrest became a powerful tool for police training programs across the country. Law enforcement agencies used it to show officers how unconscious bias could lead to discriminatory treatment and unnecessary escalation of routine encounters. 6 months after Matthews's conviction, Damon received a letter from a college admissions officer who had heard about his case. Despite his initial fears that his arrest would hurt his college prospects, several universities were actually impressed by how he had handled the situation with dignity and courage. "Your experience demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership and character we look for in our students," the letter read. "We would be honored to have you join our community." On the 1-year anniversary of his arrest, Damon walked through Riverside Heights again for the first time since that traumatic day. This time, his walk was intentional and symbolic, accompanied by his parents, his attorney, and several community supporters. As they walked down Maple Street, past the spot where Officer Matthews had first approached him, Damon felt a mixture of sadness and hope. The sadness came from knowing that his innocence had been lost that day, that his faith in the system had been shattered by one man's prejudice and abuse of power. The hope came from knowing that justice had ultimately prevailed, that the truth had been revealed, and that his experience might help protect other young people from similar treatment. Mrs. Chen watched from her living room window as the group walked past her house. She waved when Damon looked up and saw her, and he waved back with a smile that showed gratitude for her courage in recording and reporting what she had witnessed. The case had changed everyone involved. Matthews was serving his prison sentence, his career and reputation destroyed by his own actions. The police department had implemented meaningful reforms. The community had come together to support justice and accountability, and Damon Thompson, The young man who had simply been walking home from work on a warm afternoon had become a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change. His story served as a reminder that technology could be a powerful tool for justice, that ordinary citizens could make a difference by refusing to look the other way, and that even in the face of injustice, the truth has a way of eventually coming to light.